Welcome to the Founders Forum podcast, brought to you by the Foxwell Founders, where we interview some of the hottest minds in D2C right now and deep dive on their area of expertise. Everyone that we interview here is a cherished member of our Foxwell Founders community of over 550 advertisers worldwide and are at the cutting edge of what is working right now. I hope you enjoy this, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Andrew at Foxwell Digital. And now let's get stuck into this week's episode. Here are Edwin and Tris, our hosts.
Three best ways that we've ever seen to deal with this is
it's one of the things that's working really, really well for our agency right now.
Question of the week, right?
he's going to spill all the tea on TikTok for us. What is the oh wow strategy of the moment? If it's working, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Who buys it even at that time, right? Hey guys, welcome to the Foxwell Founders Forum. This time we have Brad Ploch, and he is an absolute banger. He is the co-founder and the director of WRK Marketing. So we have an absolute banger coming up for you. We're going to talk all about what matters in DTC. Edwin, do you want to kick us off?
So Brad, you are the one that focuses us in on what numbers actually matter. So tell us, what are the numbers that we need to be focusing on, and what is not, like, what should we not be focusing on?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. So I'll kind of work through my order of operations and the things that we pay attention to and the things we try to coach our clients to pay attention to. And at any point in there, if you stop and want to go deeper on anything in particular, holler, let me know, and I will stop and go deeper. I've also got triple whale pulled up on the top here because I wanted to follow through and go through because we set up all of our dashboards to represent the information that we think is most important. So the order of operations and kind of the way that we go through this, we've got the scoreboard that we measure success on, and that metric is contribution margin. I know that's kind of like everybody's saying contribution margin, this buzzword, and like it's all
what is it?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think just for anybody that doesn't know, the way that we are calculating contribution margin is you're taking revenue, subtracting out cost of delivery. Cost of delivery is anything that is a variable cost associated with getting that next sale. So cost of goods, shipping, landed cost to you. So not just the cost of unit cost to produce the next unit from your manufacturer, but you want to include the shipping from that, kind of all in cost to produce that next unit and then get it to your customer on a variable basis. Revenue, subtract out those costs, subtract out ad spend, bang, you're at contribution margin. That's basically how we calculate that. So that's the metric we pay most attention to because spend and revenue can fluctuate. But if that number is on your goal, in most cases, you're probably on track. Now, there's some caveats to that, which is why we look at a couple of other metrics. So I can kind of keep digging into some of those. So
talk just about contribution margin specifically for a second, right? Because this is the new buzzword, right? I mean, there was, first of all, you had ROAS, then you had MER, marketing efficiency ratio, and now it's contribution margin, right? Us marketers love a good buzzword, right? Yeah. Sounds like it's the most logical thing to start tracking, right? How much does it cost you to land the product in the customer's hands versus how much are you spending on it, right? Why wouldn't somebody use something like this? Does it get too technical? And, is there something that you found that you get pushback when you say, hey, what's your contribution margin?
Yeah, I think the general, I think historically, from my experience, is revenue is easier to track because when you pull up your Shopify dashboard, that's what you see, right? And that's what, until the tools of Northbeam, Triple Whale, and then the other ones that people are using these days, Shopify has really kind of made revenue really sexy, which is cool. And that's the screenshots that we all see on Twitter, and it's super fun to see everybody sharing those numbers, but that's not really the reality of the business. So I think it's been historically very easy to track those things, and contribution margin is kind of this lagging thing that eventually your bookkeeper tells you at the end of the month when the month finally closes and you wrap everything up. But at the end of the day, if you're not producing a positive contribution, you are at the risk of running out of business, potentially, right? There are other things associated with that, operating expenses that have to come out of that, and so you still need to produce a net profit. But I think it's just generally been very easy to focus on revenue first, and then work your way back to contribution margin. So I would say, honestly, that's probably one of the reasons why. It's just been historically a little difficult to track.
And so what are the benchmark contribution margins like? And if the answer is it depends, like tell me the brackets and tell me the benchmarks.
Yeah. So of course it depends on several things, but
Always.
generally speaking, if you're trying to build a profitable business,
Yeah.
contribution margin needs to be higher than your fixed operating expenses on a monthly basis. So if you have a team that you're paying 5 grand a month, and you have a warehouse lease that you're paying 5 grand a month for, and $5,000 of other expenses, you're at $15,000 in OpEx. If you can't produce more than $15,000 in OpEx, you're not producing a profit. Now, you may have cash in the bank. If
Yeah.
you had $15,000 in revenue, you might have $15,000 that you can put towards that OpEx. But every single month that you aren't producing a positive contribution, you're working yourself towards a more negative cash position, which means you can't afford things in real time. If you need to buy inventory, you're not going to have cash to do that. You need to pay your employees, you're not going to have cash to do that. That's like the basis of it, and that's where we start with a lot of our clients is, okay, we need to make sure that that number is higher than OpEx, bare
Yeah.
minimum, and then we'll focus on setting new targets and goals from there.
And so, but what are the percentages? Because sometimes we walk through our customers the same math, and then they want unreasonable like contribution margins. Like they want like a 40% contribution margin, and then I say I would like a lot of things in life as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Percentages are difficult for me because I think percentages can cover up a lot of things, right? So our clients generally, we hear very similar things. I want to have a 5x MER. Well, it's like MER or ROAS goals need to come with an expectation of spend, because you could have a 5x MER and spend $10,000, or you
Yeah.
could have a 5x MER and spend $100,000, and those are very different outcomes. You could have a 3x MER at $100,000 and spend, and you have a very different contribution margin. So percentages for that reason are difficult for me, but at the same time, I understand. If marketing is taking up, I think I saw Hims earning reports, and they spend half of their revenue on marketing. And there are businesses where that just
Makes
doesn't make
sense.
sense to do, right? Some businesses cannot do that. Their cost of goods is too high. They just cannot afford to do that. So it depends a little bit on the business. So it's really hard to give like a specific range. But from a percentage basis, we've seen net profit as a 10 to 20% is kind of a range. So contribution generally sits a little bit above that. But percentages can hide things as well. So just a little difficult to give a number there.
Well, for sure. And then you've got your CAC as well. So like you look at your CAC to LTV ratio, that's going to have a massive impact on it as well. It's depending on how much you want to spend. If you've got a really good LTV, especially from a 6-month LTV point of view, so that's lifetime value. If you're getting a really strong 6-month lifetime value, and people keep coming back and over again, subscription models are pretty good at this, then you can afford to spend a little bit more depending on your operating expenditure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, what do you say? So, contribution margin, that's one of your metrics. What are the other ones that are on your board?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you mentioned. So I'm looking back up here to follow through this, and I need to give a little bit of a shout out. I can't take too much credit for this because we borrowed this format from CTC a little bit. We added it a little to add our own flavor to it, but I need to get that out before I take too much credit here. So contribution margin at the top, we call that the scoreboard. The next thing is these business level metrics. So that's going to be total sales. You can include all channels, inclusive of Amazon or retail if you'd like, but for a lot of our clients, it's Shopify. So total sales, ad spend, MER, and then AOV is one we just throw in there. We're looking at AOV, you really want to split it between new and returning customers, but that kind of business level metrics tells you really quickly. If you have an understanding of what your general cost of goods is, when you look at MER, you know if that number is good or bad, right? Once you start to really understand your numbers, you say, hey, I need a 3x in order to be profitable on on this business or produce a positive contribution. If that number says 2.5, you should immediately throw up red flag and say, okay, I've got to course correct and do something here. But it doesn't stop there at those business level metrics. And I think it's really important to take it one layer deeper minimum and go down and split out new versus returning customers. Because new customers you could be acquiring unprofitably, and repeat is covering up some kind of mess that you've created for yourself. And we see this a lot, where a lot of clients will come to us, they're spending a lot of money, and they're probably overspending because new customer acquisition has been running at a net negative for a long time, but they're sending enough emails, they have a decent LTV, the people are coming back and buying, but they're spending themselves into a little bit of a hole. So that customer layer is new customer revenue, CAC, AMER, which is just acquisition MER, and then new customers as a percentage of revenue, and then the same thing for returning customers, basically, the next line. So
you
those are
mentioned
like the 12
AMER
metrics.
there. That's another little one there. So what's that difference in AMER and MER for those who aren't aware?
Yeah, great call out. The reason we look at so MER is taking total sales divided by total ad spend. AMER is taking total new customer revenue divided by ad spend. And the reason we split those out, we spend a lot of time paying attention to AMER. And one of the reasons for that is because attribution is a funny game, right? I think we've all collectively spent years, we've lost years of our lives debating attribution, and we probably will continue to debate it. So attribution can be a tricky thing, and I think it's a worthwhile pursuit to try and pay attention to and solve and understand and hold Facebook and Google and all these channels accountable to producing positive returns for our businesses. But at the end of the day, AMER is telling you whether you are or are not profitably or contribution positively acquiring net new customers. And if that number is below break even without intentionally being there because you've made a cognitive decision to do that, you know if you're in a tricky spot. So that's kind of why we look at that number and how it differs a little bit from MER. Because MER can be propped up by repeat customers. As I said, you send an email and all of a sudden you're at a 5x MER, but you can put yourself into a wonky position pretty quickly.
So let's step back. You were talking about that secret number, right? That secret hidden number that people don't pay attention to. Tell me how you're calculating that. Like what is that number? How you're calculating that with that new customer?
The new customer AMER.
Yeah.
Yep. So new customer AMER in terms of like setting a goal for what it should be, or how you actually get to it.
How you get to it, and then setting the goal for it. Because in case our listeners they don't know, like how are you calculating it? How do you get that number, and then how do you get to the goal?
Yeah. So calculating is really straightforward. Total new customer revenue divided by total ad spend, that's AMER. So pretty simple.
Right.
Triple Whale or other dashboards allow you to set that up pretty easily. And it's something that we have right at the top of ours and make sure we look at it every single day when we open up our accounts.
Okay.
In terms of setting a goal for what that should be, there's probably a lot of context that needs to be added into this. But
Sure.
if you can set, I would say, if I could give general advice, which is probably difficult to do, but in order to make sure that you're not driving yourself out of business for sure, a good way, particularly for smaller or newer brands, is to make sure that every next dollar that you're spending is producing at least a break even on customer acquisition, because then you're going to be able to afford inventory and kind of work your way there. So the way that you calculate that and come up with an understanding of what is AMER, and I have a spreadsheet that maybe I could share with you guys if that would be helpful to link for people to help calculate this. But it's doing all the things I mentioned before. Taking your first time average order value, so new customer average order value, what is the general cost associated with that order? So it's simple if you have one SKU. You take the SKU and you see how many of those people are buying on average. You know the cost of that SKU. You know the cost of getting it to the customer. You subtract out all those variable costs associated with getting that next sale. So what are people spending? What does it cost you to get it to the customer? That tells you take that. You divide it by, you take first time AOV, subtract the cost, you're left with margin. You take revenue divided by margin, that's your break-even AMER. And now you know what your break-even AMER is. If you have a lot of SKUs, it gets a little bit trickier. You're just trying to do a blended version of what AMER should be. But generally speaking, that's kind of how you arrive at that.
You can have your overall goal. So, sorry, I'm going to ask you something there now that's not on the questions before, but actually comes really nicely into that. So, we had Jenny Lynn on the pod there a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about how she has weekly releases or a couple of events a month in terms of her guaranteed revenue sources on those, which is really, really smart, especially at scale. You can start to have guaranteed revenue sources each month that then you can build out on top of that as well. Mm-hmm. From a customer acquisition standpoint, and looking specifically at your kind of your AMER and your kind of peaks and troughs, obviously when you have sales and launches like that every week or every second or third week, that's going to really hurt in terms of measurement, because it's going to be very difficult to measure it as a whole. How are you finding that when it comes to when you're looking at a Triple Whale dashboard that might have all of that information in there, especially when it comes to contribution margin? You've got all of that information, but then how are we getting new customers? We're not necessarily talking about attribution, but you look at the month and you're like, acquired all these customers, but where do they all come from? How do you manage that?
That's interesting. And I think it's difficult and probably depends on the business specifically, but it comes a little bit with having a plan for what you expect to happen and then
Mm.
consistently measuring against that plan. Because you're probably going to be wrong at first, but it starts with I'm going to make an assumption around how many new customers will come from this product release.
Mm.
So if you look historically, maybe you can look at the last three and say, okay, I released these flavors for, I think she sells tea. I released
Mm.
these three flavors. Here's the average of new customer revenue when we release those three flavors. That becomes your baseline expectation for the next couple launches that you do. You get to the next launch and you say, hey, my expectation is it's going to be $15,000 from new customers, and you just
Mm.
if you're wrong, you try to figure out why you're wrong. AOV was off, conversion rate was off, people didn't like the flavor. That's where you start to get into using those quantitative numbers to try and understand what went wrong. But I think using historical data to kind of set an expectation and a goal, and then just consistently measuring against that goal is really important to see where you were right or wrong.
Yeah, was the assumption correct or not? Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Interesting as well, just on that. So we had Will so we had Will there. He was talking to us there just briefly about creative, about making personas on those as well. He's the CEO of Selfmade, and one of the things they do is they create creative specific to do with different personas and stuff like that as well. So one of the questions I had was like, okay, so you've got your contribution margin, your understanding of different products, but then they go and target different products and grow that out, like in different pillars, for example. So you're saying that your basic is obviously with one product, but then you're doing it with multiple products across the board. Would you ever have a client that you're working with that has multiple contribution margin goals, or do we have a three-letter acronym for contribution margin yet? Do you just call it CM?
Yeah, CM is great. CM is great. Yeah, it is wordy. That's interesting. So I think depending on, it definitely gets trickier the more SKUs that you have, and that kind of goes back to this plan, and that's where I think the movement towards media buyers being more involved in this planning. I think the media buyer role, I promise I'll get back to your question, but I think the media buyer role is shifting much more from, hey, I'm just pulling levers inside of an ad account and hoping that spend goes up and ROAS looks nice, into like, I'm having a plan for what my expectations are for the month, the quarter, and then the year, and I'm figuring out where to deploy dollars. So if I have a goal of $100,000 in revenue this month, I need to come up with a plan for spending dollars at my ROAS target that is going to get me to that. And that can be across multiple SKUs. So what we do and the way that we kind of set this up is every single time that we launch a new funnel, and I'll use that word because I think it's pretty common. The funnel, the way that I would describe the funnel is a new product, a new offer, anything that when we set up a campaign, if we have an expectation of what AOV is going to be and what we want customer acquisition cost to be. So we'll go into our calculator and we'll say, great, we're selling these joggers. Here's what we expect AOV to be on this pair of joggers. Here's what our ROAS goal is because that gets us to contribution. Great. Now we're going to go set up that campaign. We're going to hold that campaign accountable to a specific margin target, which might be different than the t-shirt campaign, which might be different from the backpack campaign. Right. So
Gotcha.
it's for each product, each funnel, I guess. And that's why we build campaigns in the way that we do, is to be able to hold those accountable to a very specific expectation of what we want ROAS and contribution margin to be.
What are
Makes sense.
common gotchas so once you get someone on the contribution margin bandwagon, right? They got the t-shirt, they got the swag, they got everything, right? What are common gotchas that people run into that they might have not expected when they first got on?
Yeah. So from like a client perspective,
Yeah, like for example, we preach contribution margin a lot, and I had a swimwear brand in February call me and say we're at zero contribution margin. Our accountant is telling us to pull the plug on ads, and I told her account to go F himself because he understands the spreadsheet, but I understand the business. And then in March, they had their best month ever,
yeah.
right? And so what are common gotchas that you encounter because you've been doing it for so long?
Yeah. I think I'm glad you said that because that gets me a really nice starting point. So thank you for teeing that up. Seasonality is a big thing because you can't have the same expectation of contribution margin on a monthly basis if you have a highly seasonal business. Swimwear is a great one. We have a client that sells dog products that help dogs be cool during the summer. February looks miserable, right? Like you can't have that same expectation of February that you're going to have of July. So having a seasonal expectation of contribution margin is definitely important. And I think kind of along with that is that repeat customers can cover up the contribution margin problem as well. So that's why, although that's a really important number to look at, it can't come without the context of new customer acquisition and repeat customers. Because if we're calculating contribution margin as, hey, we're taking new customer revenue, subtracting out the variable cost to get there, subtracting out ad spend, and that's where we're left, there's a lot fewer dollars there as when you're sending an email to repeat customers and you only have to pay for the cost of getting that product to them. There's a lot more margin there. So I think just having that context that when you do a sale and when you send an email and when you get a lot of repeat purchases, that can inflate contribution margin in the short term. And if you don't have an expectation of, kind of how the repeat customers feed into making money, you could think things look great. And then you continue to run sales and you continue to send emails. And so you deplete your list to a point of where they're not coming back, but you weren't filling up that, I guess, funnel is maybe the word to use there. You weren't filling up that funnel to eventually continue to be squeezed. It needs to be this constant ongoing filling of that funnel.
Sure. So, I mean, we talked a lot about contribution margin. We're talking about CAC. I mean, one of the big things is obviously, so what are the main kind of goals or KPIs that you would see in the platform that is a misleader, right? So people talk about hook rate, hold rate, all this stuff, which is great. It's great for engagement. What's the one that people is the red herring that is coming up these days?
Yeah, I think ROAS can be one of them. I think ROAS is, it's interesting, and I think people get married to ROAS being high and the goal always being a higher ROAS when the goal isn't necessarily it's a higher ROAS. It's understanding the relationship between what Meta is reporting, for example, and what AMER is reporting inside of whatever dashboard you're using. Because you could have we have clients of ours where they have a really long purchase cycle where a 7-day click is never going to capture the full attribution of what that's responsible for. And then we have people where 1-day click is capturing 90% of it, and we feel really accurate. We feel really confident that that's reporting very well. So I think understanding the dynamics of your business is really important, and then understanding that the goal isn't to maximize ROAS. Obviously, getting ROAS higher while maintaining spend is great. That's cool, but the goal isn't always to make ROAS go up. It's to try and spend more while focusing on that efficiency not dropping too fast to make sure that the next dollar was always worth spending. So I think ROAS is helpful. I'm not trying to say that it's not helpful. And I think the ones that you mentioned are actually probably more red herrings, right? Like thumbstop and click-through rates and things like that. I think people can get a little bit, like making a decision to turn ads off based on click-through rate is probably something we really don't ever do because I don't see any correlations with performance. I understand like the use case and creative iteration potentially, but I think if you looked at an ad that wasn't getting any spend and you looked at an ad that was getting a ton of spend and not working, you make the assumption that they're both not working. You can come up with a million different reasons on your own by looking at that ad as to why it's not working, and you didn't need thumbstop to get you to do that. I think you can make similar assumptions. So a little bit of a deviation there, but I think ROAS can be misleading depending on how you're looking at it.
Sure, absolutely. We talk about you're looking at Triple Whale there. You're looking at a dashboard that you have. You've got your Northbeam. You've got your Google Analytics. You've got Shopify data. Obviously, every brand requires a single source of truth and requires something to kind of lean towards. Now, obviously, Triple Whale sounds like the one that you love, but without kind of bigging up Triple Whale too much, why using that versus say a Google Analytics or something like that when you've got, say, I'm a brand spending a couple $100 a month. I'm running Facebook, Meta, TikTok, Google. How do I know where my CAC is coming from if I'm not using something like that?
That's great. I should add a caveat that we invested in Triple Whale. So like if I sound biased, and I'm going to try to be very objective here. That's where my bias is potentially coming from. But I'm not saying Triple Whale from a perspective of using Triple Whale and Triple Whale's Pixel or believing Triple Whale's Pixel. I'm looking at Triple Whale and the flexibility of how their dashboard has allowed us to set up the dashboard. I spend most of my attention is spent on those metrics that I mentioned, which have nothing to do with the pixel at all. You don't need a platform like Triple Whale or Northbeam to get to that. You just need the ability to see contribution margin, total sales, total spend, new customer revenue, AMER, and anything that can get you there is the essentials. And I think to your point, there are so many different things that you can look at. and say, okay, well, Facebook says this, Google says this, AMER says this. At the end of the day, it's focusing on, I think, MER and AMER, and then making an assumption around what Facebook needs to be. I need Facebook to be at a 2x on a 7-day click basis this month. I'm going to spend this accordingly. Here's what I think is going to happen. If you go that month and you hit those numbers and Facebook was a 2x and you hit your spend goals and you look at AMER and you're like, shit, I missed. Your assumption was wrong. You need to go back and revise the assumption. So it's not, you don't need triple whale pixel or North Memes pixel to get you there. Maybe those are things that help. I'm not really a huge fan of them one way or another. I think if you like them, great. It's all about, I think, sticking with something, making assumptions, and then looking back to see if those assumptions were correct.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense to me. And this is the thing, right? We've talked. I think we've probably used every 3-letter acronym there is out there, right? But I guess somebody getting into this, somebody starting kind of 5, 10, 15 grand spend a month that makes that return. You don't need to have a degree in maths and accounting to be able to do this stuff. Yeah. It's basic maths, right? Spend less than you're making. It's as easy as that. That's what business is. But people and marketers especially find a very easy way of complicating it. So, all these MER, AMER, CM, everything else. It's just a fancy way of saying spend less than you're making and you'll do well. And keep some money for tax as well. That's an important thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, damn.
All right, guys, we had a ton on the plate today. We were talking with Brad about contribution margin, the latest buzzword. We gave you the buzziest buzz about it, all the stuff that you need to pay attention to, you don't need to pay attention to. It's been wild. I'm Edwin.
I'm Tris.
I'm Brad.
We'll see you on the next one.
See you next one.